All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the 2007-2008 National Public Policy Forum Finals. My name is Kit Sars, and I'm Executive Director of the Bickle and Brewer Foundation. We have some new folks with us this afternoon for the finals debate, so we're going to review a little bit of what we went over this morning about the National Public Policy Forum. First of all, a big round of applause for all four of our teams who made it this far to New York. They had some tough competition along the way and have been working on this program since last fall, and we're really thrilled to have everyone here. And we will introduce all four teams in just a minute, but our finalists momentarily as well. As you can see in your printed program, the National Public Policy Forum was founded in 2001 by the national litigation firm of Bickle and Brewer. It's the only national contest that gives high school students the opportunity to participate in written and oral debates on issues of public policy. Open to any public or private high school in the country, this free program is now jointly administered by Bickle and Brewer and New York University. Last October, we invited schools from across the country to submit essays on the public policy topic, Resolved: the United States federal government should substantially increase its AIDS, HIV public health assistance to sub-Saharan Africa. These students here today and hundreds of others from across the country accepted the invitation to participate in this year's contest. At that point, a single elimination written debate tournament began. The judging continued for several months until March 5th, when our final four teams, those that you see here today, were announced. The final four teams were invited to New York this weekend as guests of the Bickle and Brewer Foundation, and they have been supplementing their written arguments with oral advocacy today. And another thing that's fun we want to mention to you, for the first time today, as many of you know, we are streaming the final debates, and we streamed the semifinal debates earlier this morning over the internet. Tuna Snyder, Professor Tuna Snyder, who was a judge earlier today, and Travis Carter, who is the Director of Communications for Bickle and Brewer, coordinated this new element of the competition. So we hope everyone encouraged your family members and those at home to log on and watch. And we welcome all of you all, hello, out there in the World Wide Web watching us today. We're thrilled to have you. All right, so now to our fantastic students. In the first semifinal debate this morning, Colleyville Heritage High School of Colleyville, Texas, took on Wellington High School of Wellington, Florida. Colleyville Heritage advanced. Colleyville Heritage is representing the affirmative in the final debate. They're coached by Dave Houston, and the participants this afternoon are Lyndon Lee, Andrew Murray, Alex Naz, and Jonathan Wang. In our second semifinal debate this morning, Kahuku Intermediate and High School, all the way from Kahuku, Hawaii, and actually they wore leis around their suits when they were participating, took on Bellaire High School of Bellaire, Texas. Bellaire advanced. Bellaire is coached by Russell Rock, and the participants today are Jenny Fan, Andrew Garbarino, Vijay Kasha, and Satish Vimuri. Best of luck to you. We're very proud of you and so glad you're here today. And now to introduce our distinguished moderator and our judges. Distinguished, right here. David Baker, everybody. David Baker currently serves as the Director of Admission for the St. Mark's School of Texas in Dallas. Prior to assuming his position at St. Mark's, he coached debate and taught public speaking for 16 years at St. Mark's. Under his direction, the St. Mark's debate program was named one of the 10 most successful programs of the 20th century. In 2003, Mr. Baker was inducted into the National Forensic League Hall of Fame, and he was also presented with the Distinguished Community Service Award by the National Debate Coaches Association. He has been a long-time supporter of the NPPF, working with the law firm of Bickle and Brewer to develop this national competition. I'm going to introduce our distinguished judges in alphabetical order, so I apologize, it's going to go a little out of order, but that's so I don't get lost in my pages. Mr. Brewer, Bill Brewer. Mr. Brewer co-founded Bickle and Brewer in 1984. Since that time, he has earned a nationwide reputation as one of the most successful lawyers in the U.S., practicing exclusively in the field of complex commercial litigation and dispute resolution. Testament to the significance of Mr. Brewer's caseload are the news organizations that routinely mention his work. The Wall Street Journal, Associated Press, Forbes, Fortune, the National Law Journal, and many other prominent media outlets have all recently reported on Mr. Brewer's legal representation. He is a co-founding partner of the Bickle and Brewer Foundation, and actually, Mr. Bickle, John Bickle, is out here too in the audience. John, if you'll stand so we can see you as well. There's Mr. Bickle. And he plays a leading role in the Foundation's award-winning educational and community outreach programs. A former debater himself, Mr. Brewer helped found the NPPF and now serves on its advisory board. In support of the program and its commitment to academic achievement, he also works with a variety of forensic organizations, including the National Forensic League. And he is a founding member of the Dallas-based advisory board for the National Association of Urban Debate Leagues. Next, alphabetically, but here closest to me, Scott Dethridge. As of this past Monday, Scott Dethridge is the very brand new executive director of the National Association of Urban Debate Leagues. He is 5 days into the job. He comes to the NAUDL from a historic tenure as the director of debate at Northwestern University, where he coached the champions of the National Debate Tournament 7 times since 1994. Not surprisingly, he was named Coach of the Decade for the 1990s. Dr. Dethridge received his Ph.D. in Communication Studies from Northwestern, his M.A. in Communication Studies from Baylor University, Texas School, and his BBA in Economics and Finance, also from Baylor. Lenny Gale. Lenny's right down, 2 down from him. Lenny Gale is an attorney in Chicago. He is a former prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois, Deputy General Counsel for Bank One, and partner at Bartlett, Beck, Herman, Palanchar, and Scott. He was also an associate at Kirkland & Ellis, which he joined after clerking for the Honorable James B. Moran in the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. For the past year, Mr. Gale has been working full-time as board chair and interim executive director, so he's very glad that Dr. Dethridge showed up, interim executive director of the NAUDL. He is a former high school and college debater himself and was voted the debater of the 1980s, as opposed to the, coach of the decade for the 1990s. Sorry, Lenny, I'm dating you. He also represented the U.S. in 1985 in the biennial U.S.-Japanese exchange debates. Melissa Maxey Wade, right here in between our 2 NAUDL gentlemen. Melissa Maxey Wade has been Director of Forensics at Emory University since 1972. She is the Executive Director of the Atlanta Urban Debate League, Director of the Emory National Debate Institute, and Co-Executive Director of the National Debate Project. She serves on the Academic Board of Directors of the International Debate Education Association and the Associated Leaders of Urban Debate. Ms. Wade is one of only 3 university debate coaches in the U.S. who has served on the National Associated Press Presidential Debate Evaluation Panel for every U.S. presidential election since 1976. Ms. Wade is a member of the NPPF Advisory Board. Sheldon Prentice. Sheldon, want to wave to us? There you are. Sheldon Prentice is Senior Vice President and General Counsel for Merchants Bank Shares. Mr. Prentice was Senior Vice President, General Counsel, and Corporate Secretary at Chittenden Corporation and Chittenden Trust Company for more than 22 years. He is incoming chairman of the Vermont Bankers Association, serving as chair of the Government Relations Committee for a number of years, and is currently on the executive committee. A graduate of Dartmouth College and Fordham University Law School, right here in New York City, Mr. Prentice continues to stay involved with his schools, and he is currently chair of Green Up Vermont and a trustee of Vermont Legal Aid. He taught U.S. history to American service personnel stationed in Germany from 1972 to 74, and taught securities regulations as an adjunct professor of Vermont Law School from 1981 to 1989. John Sexton. John Edward Sexton is the 15th president of New York University and the Benjamin Butler Professor of Law and NYU Law School's Dean Emeritus. President Sexton is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a member of both the Association of American University Presidents, where he's on the executive committee, and the Council on Foreign Relations. He was the founding chair of the board of the NASD Dispute Resolution, and recently the chairman of the board of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He serves as vice chair of the board for the New York Academy of Sciences and is the treasurer of the Commission of Independent Colleges and Universities in New York. While dean of the law school, he was president of the Association of American Law Schools. He holds many honorary degrees and has received many, many awards, including Outstanding High School Debate Coach of the last 50 years. Before coming to NYU, President Sexton clerked for several judges, among them Chief Justice Warren Burger of the U.S. Supreme Court. Finally, and most importantly, to us anyway, he is a member of the NPPF Advisory Board and co-sponsor of the annual NPPF competition. James Traub. James Traub is a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine and was a staff writer for the New Yorker. He has written extensively about international affairs, especially the United Nations. Most recently, Mr. Traub authored the critically acclaimed book, The Best Intentions, Kofi Annan and the UN in the Era of American World Power. His previous books include The Devil's Playground, A Century of Pleasure and Profit in Times Square, and City on a Hill, a book on open admissions at City College that won the Sidney Hillman Award for Nonfiction. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And finally, our last judge, down there on the end, Scott Wunn. Scott Wunn has been executive director of the National Forensic League since 2003, also known as the NFL. And coincidentally, the NFL draft is going on in New York today. We were trying to see if Scott could get us in because he has all this stuff that says NFL. We thought maybe that could get us into the draft. He earned his Bachelor of Arts degree from Graceland University in 1993 and his Master's degree in Communication Studies from the University of Northern Iowa in 1999. He began his career with the National Forensic League as a forensics coach and classroom instructor. During his 10-year coaching career, his students experienced great success, including several national finalists and the 2002 National Championship in Humorous Interpretation. He is a Diamond Coach and a member of the Key Coach Society of the Barclay Forum for High Schools. During his current tenure as the executive director of the league, Mr. Wunn is most proud of the advancements the NFL has made in coach education programs, community-related program development, alumni engagement, and communication and cooperation among the leadership of the league. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for our distinguished moderator and judges. These guys are so accomplished and have done so much that even shortening their bios, it takes a little while to get through. They are fantastic, and we're thrilled to have such an amazing brain trust in the room, but not to intimidate our debaters. They're very nice. And now I will direct your attention to Mr. Baker, who will explain the rules of the competition and get our proceedings underway. A quick reminder, please, to turn off any cell phones. Thank you, and enjoy the debate.
Kit, thank you. And welcome to everyone to the finals of the National Public Policy Forum. And I'm sure we're going to have a great time this afternoon. I will let you know that the timing will be a little bit dependent. As we discussed this morning, folks, it'll be a little bit dependent on where the questioning leads and how things go. And I'll ask you to watch me for some of those signals, and we'll move down the line as quickly as we can. But in case you hadn't figured it out yet, a great number of my peers and a whole bunch of my heroes are up here on this stage, so it's not likely that I'm going to cut them off, because they'll cut me one of those looks they used to cut me when I was your age, and that would be bad. So we'll just play this as we can. I would like to remind all of the judges and our entire audience that the sides in this debate were determined by a coin flip, and so we would ask both the panel and our open-minded audience to remember that we are evaluating the contestants in this debate on the basis of the clarity of their arguments, their evidentiary support, the depth of their analysis, their reputation, and the quality of their presentation, and would remind the judges that they were assigned sides by the toss of a coin, and that personal opinions probably shouldn't have any place in deciding who you vote for as the winner in this debate. With no further ado, we will begin the debate with opening presentations by team captains, 10 minutes each, and we will begin with the opening statement of the affirmative.
The HIV/AIDS epidemic presents a health and policy crisis for sub-Saharan Africa, and now is the critical time to act. The House recently passed a piece of legislation reauthorizing PEPFAR and suggesting a $50 billion increase. So the question is not whether or not there are sufficient funds for an increase of assistance, but what direction this assistance should take. Existing measures, while steps in the right direction, lack focus. The virus continues to devastate sub-Saharan African population, largely due to a lack of medical infrastructure and a shortage of health professionals. Current approaches emphasize the provision of antiretroviral drugs, and while providing ARVs has its merit, dumping these drugs without developing a feasible, long-term system of distribution is counterproductive. Therefore, it is imperative that we affirm the resolution. The United States federal government should substantially increase its HIV/AIDS public health assistance to Sub-Saharan Africa by establishing a global health service program to expand the capacity of infrastructure and community health workers in the President's emergency plan for AIDS relief-focused countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. The HIV/AIDS epidemic is an unprecedented threat to the international community. The disease imperils the security of all nations by burdening healthcare systems and adversely impacting economies and societies. The concern is acute in Sub-Saharan Africa, which is the region most heavily affected by HIV/AIDS, with infection rates in some countries over 30%. The HIV prevalence rates in this region are due to the lack of adequate healthcare systems, exacerbated by a dearth of health workers. According to Laurie Garrett, Senior Fellow for Global Health at the Council on Foreign Relations, health systems are key, and quick fix approaches to disease surveillance and control won't work in countries that have no adequate systems of public health care. The overwhelming lack of infrastructure complicates treatment and prevention, allowing the virus to spread mercilessly. Garrett, in her January 2007 foreign policy article, warns that focusing on HIV/AIDS may lead to a myopic focus at the expense of other health services. Using the proposal she endorses, however, the affirmative directly establishes infrastructure, sends American volunteers, and uses native health professionals through a global health service which bypasses implementation difficulties to African nations and opens up resources to fight the disease. HIV/AIDS perpetuates cycles of conflict and poverty, depriving African nations of a stable source of labor and weakening economic foundations. Direct economic assistance to businesses or governments is ineffective without first addressing the disease. According to former World Bank Director James Wolfenson, nothing we have seen as a greater challenge to the peace and stability of African societies than the epidemic of AIDS. Garrett continues to state that AIDS weakens immune systems and only fosters increased vulnerability to other diseases. Current U.S. assistance fails to address critical factors of sustainable health measures, the development of healthcare infrastructure, and the retention of African health professionals. According to Fitzhugh Mullen, professor of prevention and community health at George Washington University, the dearth of health workers to treat and care for HIV-infected individuals has reached crisis proportions. The few health professionals practicing in many of those countries highly impacted by HIV/AIDS, often stressed, ill-prepared, and scant in number, must now cope with a staggering new burden of disease while at the same time acquiring the knowledge, skills, and technology necessary to deliver lifelong antiretroviral drug regimens, clinical and palliative care, and prevention services. The shortage is reflected by the fact that only one doctor is produced for every 115,000 people in Sub-Saharan Africa. The shortage of healthcare professionals is worsening. Recent studies show that less than 10% of doctors trained in Zambia since its independence in 1964 are still in the country. The other 90% have migrated to Europe and the United States. Numerous other African countries exhibit a similar exodus. For instance, 80% of Ghana's doctors leave the country within 5 years of finishing their studies. The bottom line is that numerous push and pull factors exist to encourage emigration, and without remedial steps, this tremendous shortage of healthcare workers in Sub-Saharan Africa will continue to cripple the fight against AIDS. Robust numbers of well-trained healthcare workers are the first step to establishing and maintaining effective healthcare infrastructure. As stated by the Joint Learning Initiative, a consortium of over 100 global health leaders, we need to urgently develop strategies to mobilize, retain, and train health workers to combat HIV/AIDS and other problems while steadily building healthcare systems. Without functioning public health and medical systems in place, PEPFAR and its like are just big band-aids that barely cover gaping wounds. Absent infrastructure, the antiretroviral drugs and other treatment methods are only a temporary solution at best. Inadequate infrastructure also prevents the distribution of drugs, with fewer than 25% of Africans who needed ARVs to survive receiving them, and the fraction dwindling to less than 5% in rural areas. Lack of proper distribution methods also fosters a black market in ARVs. Patients may be registering for treatment at more than one PEPFAR-supported clinic so that they can receive duplicate doses of their medication. Redundant doses of ARVs resurface in black markets, where they are then sold to those who lack access to clinics and sites that distribute the drugs. This is extremely dangerous because haphazard self-medication will increase the risk that a user's HIV infection will become drug resistant. Such a mutation would intensify the HIV/AIDS problem, and preventing such a catastrophe will require appropriate training, support, and quality control of providers and health sectors. The establishment of a global health service to build healthcare capacity in impoverished regions is crucial. By focusing on the training of local health workers, the program would bring U.S. expertise to the region. The program, according to Paul Davis, Director of Government Relations at the Health Global Access Project, can serve as a temporary catalyst for building new healthcare capacity while simultaneously allowing health professionals to engage in education and training to local persons to improve healthcare outcomes, indigenous healthcare delivery capacity, and self-sufficiency. The principal benefit of such health workers is that they are likely to remain in rural and deprived areas, as Delanio Dovlo, former National Director of Human Resource Development, states, "Many substitute workers accept postings and are likely to remain in rural and deprived areas. They may relate with communities by being less elitist and more integrated. In Tanzania, 75% of substitute health workers worked in rural areas. These homegrown doctors can serve as a first line of referral to health professionals, guarantee consistent usage and distribution of ARVs, but will have less incentive to succumb to the various pull factors that are decimating current African health services." Furthermore, the GHS would provide comprehensive sex education, which would dispel popular myths about HIV/AIDS, especially in underserved populations where the most egregious abuse of women take place. This education would also include information about avoiding mother-to-child transmission of HIV/AIDS, one of the most common transmission processes. The United States can and should play a crucial role in the development of healthcare infrastructure to combat HIV/AIDS, and the positive effects could have a ripple effect for the rest of the world. A GHS can provide health service concurrent with and primarily as a means to train and activate local replacement, strengthen health systems, and reach underserved areas and populations. As stated by Bradley Thayer, an international affairs senior analyst at the National Institute for Public Policy, the United States has extensive influence in international politics, allowing it to cooperate with others. Multinational organizations experience major cleavages that divide the international body on matters great and trivial, hampering their ability to act decisively. A leading role should be assigned to the United States when dealing with public health issues such as HIV/AIDS because there is no other state, group of states, or international organization that can provide these global benefits. According to Mullen, PEPFAR would both symbolize the commitment and catalyze the movement of U.S. health professionals overseas to help in the global counterattack against HIV/AIDS and demonstrate American compassion and civic spirit. Professor of Medicine and Bioethics, Solomon Benatar, and Professor of Sociology and Bioethics, Renee Fox, state that the United States is the country with the most potential to favorably influence global health trends. The United States has become a cultural model and not only has the scientific, political, and economic capacity to assume major responsibility for improving world health, but also has a moral obligation to exemplify and implement values in action that are conducive to this advancement. Organizations like the World Health Organization, on the other hand, fail when it comes to addressing the HIV/AIDS issue, failing to meet condom distribution goals and exacerbating the problem by myopically scaling up antiretroviral treatment for those already suffering from HIV/AIDS while paying relatively little attention to preventing infections in the first place. It's time for the WHO to stop playing Russian roulette with persons' lives. As cited by Roger Bate, resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research, sloppy practices by the WHO meant that thousands of patients around the world received drugs of substandard quality. The WHO just assumed that Indian drugs would be bioequivalent, but on later inspection, the ARVs provided failed bioequivalence tests. Additionally, the Chicago Journal of International Law reports that due to new changes to the international health regulations of 2005, the WHO has moved from a coordinator of public health services into an international regulatory body, who is more inclined to quarantine nations who have reported outbreaks of disease than to find an actual solution to the problem. PEPFAR is a tried and true program, and it would be counterproductive just to disband it because of some hypothetical shortcomings. According to Chris Smith, senior member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and ranking member of the Subcommittee on Africa and Global Health, from a testimonial at the beginning of this month, recent data from Zimbabwe and Kenya mirror the success of Uganda's ABC approach to preventing HIV. These three countries have demonstrated reductions in the HIV prevalence rates in those countries. The data point to significant abstinence and be faithful behavior change. In Zimbabwe, prevalence fell by 23% from 1998 to 2003, and by a remarkable 49% among women. The successes were achieved not through condoms, but by getting people to change their sexual behavior. Over 1 million people in sub-Saharan Africa died as a result of HIV/AIDS in 2007. The United States can embrace this opportunity for meaningful leadership through a global health service, establishing a healthcare infrastructure and building a core of African health professionals. We thus urge the panel to affirm the resolution and to move towards a long-term solution to the HIV/AIDS crisis in sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you. We have the opening statement by the captain of the negative team for a period not to exceed 10 minutes. You're on.
Okay, before I begin, though, I would like to thank the Bickle & Brewer Law Firm and New York University for hosting this excellent educational program. And specifically, we would like to thank William A. Brewer III and John W. Bickle II. Also, we would like to thank Kit Sawyers, Kristen Miles, NYU President John Sexton, and the NYU debate team. We'd also like to thank our very distinguished judging panel, Dr. Dethridge, Ms. Wade, Mr. Gale, Mr. Prentice, President Sexton again, Mr. Brewer again, Mr. Traub, and Mr. One. And also, we would like to thank our coach, Russell Rock, and our worthy opponents from Colleyville for an enjoyable and spirited debate. Okay. Today's discussion is about two competing policies. One, a piecemeal regional solution administered by the United States and advocated by the affirmative, and the other, a globally orchestrated effort that we will advocate. The affirmative proposes to increase global health workers in Africa through a U.S. administered program, the Global Health Services. We, the negative, propose instead that the United States federal government should fund the 2008 World Health Organization Global Health Worker Proposal, which will support the World Health Organization and Global Fund as per the recommendations articulated at the International Conference on Task Shifting, which occurred in January of this year. Also, the World Health Organization Health Worker Shortage Program is the superior policy in this round. The proposal, as outlined by the WHO in January, calls for training global health workers in all countries impacted by HIV, including Africa, India, Southeast Asia, South America, Russia, and China. The program would emphasize training community health workers, and the United States will shoulder the $8 billion cost of this program. 2.4 million physicians, doctors, and midwives will be created. The U.S. will also terminate all current Presidential Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR, initiatives and redirect all PEPFAR money into the Global Fund for HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. This was the U.S. stance on HIV before the Bush administration created PEPFAR and withdrew support for the WHO and Global Fund in 2003. This counterplan would avoid problems that would occur if the U.S. attempts its own independent global health service policy. It also brings the United States back in line with the international community. Several of the affirmative author advocates admit that WHO implementation is preferable to affirmative action, including Lori Garrett, Senior Fellow on the Council for Foreign Relations. Also cited by the affirmative, Garrett actually states that the WHO is the only organization with the clout to bring in and administer a program with international aspect. And I quote, "Donors often function as competitors, and the only organization with the political credibility to compel cooperative thinking on the HIV is the WHO." The affirmative also quotes Fitzhugh Mullen of George Washington University, who states that the WHO needs to increase its investment in the world health sector dedicated to fighting AIDS. In this speech, I will prove 4 things. 1, that the affirmative proposal is insufficient to stop the HIV crisis in Africa and around the globe. And that 2, the affirmative is non-topical. They are not a substantial increase in public health assistance to sub-Saharan Africa for HIV assistance, and they are extra topical because they divert resources to 3 PEPFAR countries that are outside of sub-Saharan Africa. 3, that independent U.S. action will only disrupt international efforts directed at Africa and disrupt internal African responses to the HIV crisis. And also 4, implementing the WHO counterproposal alone is the best policy prescription for stopping HIV both globally and in Africa. Our first point is that the affirmative proposal is far too small. Even assuming optimal conditions of training and implementation, because of its insubstantial size, the affirmative proposal will not stop HIV in Africa. And because of its regional approach, it would not stop the brain drain of community health workers from the African continent. One of the affirmative author advocates, Lori Garrett, who is a senior fellow on the Council for Foreign Relations, admitted that a U.S. initiative to train community health workers in Africa would not be substantial. As noted in their last round, the affirmative plan would allocate only $100 million a year to train health workers. Furthermore, their primary author advocate, Mullen, states that the plan would send only 150 doctors to the 13 African countries, Guyana, Haiti, and Vietnam, and those countries cumulatively make up the 15 PEPFAR countries, for the first 2 years. And I quote, "Assignments will be made for a minimum of 2 years. The committee proposes an initial deployment of 150 U.S. Global Health Service Corps professionals to the 15 PEPFAR countries." This poses several problems for the affirmative advocacy. A, the affirmative is not topical. Subpoint 1, the affirmative maintains that a $10 million a year increase in HIV expenditure is substantial. But according to Cates, the United States currently spends $4 million per year on HIV assistance, meaning that the United States already spends almost 25 times more money than called for by the affirmative. Or alternatively stated, the affirmative proposal represents less than a 3% increase in funding for the African HIV assistance. And secondly, the affirmative is extra topical. When they implement their program, they affect all of PEPFAR, including 3 countries outside of Africa, them being Haiti, Guyana, and Vietnam. And B, the parameters of the problem are too large to be impacted by the affirmative. There is a shortage of 1.5 million health workers in sub-Saharan Africa. Assuming that all money allocated by the affirmative were spent on health workers, and assuming that doctors employed by the affirmative train 100 health workers a year, in 2 years the affirmative will have produced only 30,000 health workers. Assuming that even 10 times the amount of community health workers could be produced, the affirmative produces only 300,000 health workers. The budget figures also prove the deficiency. The affirmative provides 1/80th of the funding required. The World Health Organization estimates in 2008 that $8 billion will be required over the next 5 years to train and retain the minimum necessary number of healthcare workers to contain the pandemic worldwide. The affirmative would only allocate $100 million per year. And C, the affirmative causes brain drain because its efforts are localized to the African community. It does not address the global community health worker shortage, meaning that the majority of the health workers trained under the affirmative will leave. And because the affirmative only addresses the African region, health workers trained by the affirmative will seek jobs elsewhere in areas of the globe more in need. Our second point is that independent U.S. action will cause several disadvantages. Passing the affirmative would A, only perpetuate PEPFAR's flawed policies, B, decrease international cooperation, specifically with the European Union, and C, escalate a proxy war in Somalia. Our first point is that the affirmative policy will become PEPFAR Part 2. As explained by Mullen, their primary author advocate, the Global Health Fund would work with the PEPFAR countries and be closely administered by the Bush administration. And I quote, fiscal, administrative, and management matters should be handled by the single organizational entity that will be dedicated to the mission of mobilizing U.S. personnel to work in PEPFAR-focused countries, and that the U.S. Global Health Service should be a program of the federal government. Also, it's in order for the Global Health Service to relate closely to PEPFAR and participate in the annual budget process. And in all likelihood, and absent of a specific affirmative provision, the AF program will be administered by the Office of the Global AIDS Coordinator. President Bush can easily appoint Mark R. Dybel, the current director of both PEPFAR and the Office of the Global AIDS Coordinator, thereafter referred to as OGAC, and an active faith-based supporter. HIV programs to direct this program as well. The U.S. Leadership Against HIV, AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria Act of 2003 created the Office of the Global AIDS Coordinator, which now oversees all HIV AIDS programs. The faith-based initiatives trained doctors created by the affirmative will provide education, prevention, and counseling stressing the failed ABC, or abstinence, be faithful, or condoms ideology used in Africa that has actually increased HIV transmission rates. Even if the affirmative avoids direct affiliation with PEPFAR, the affirmative would be a direct clone of its predecessor, and it would be PEPFAR Part 2 with its same bureaucracy, red tape, and ideological mission. Historically, the Bush administration and the executive director of PEPFAR emphasized the ABC model approach to HIV/AIDS. These policies are intended to enrich its political supporters and favor U.S. faith-based initiatives. This education model de-emphasizes condom use, promotes unrealistic abstinence, and causes confusion amongst the middle class. And this has empirically resulted in increased HIV rates over time. Some experts like Dr. William Ross and Yafat Suskin, who is the director of an international women's rights organization, claim that Ugandan HIV prevalence rates are now as high as 30% due to PEPFAR intervention. And also, the negative points out that PEPFAR's FDA drug requirements are intended to benefit U.S. pharmaceutical companies, and absent appointing a new president for the United States, the affirmative project will be held hostage to the same conservative tendencies. And also, C, the affirmative policy would erode international cooperation. According to The Guardian, the EU and the World Health Organization don't like being undermined in their HIV policies and have repeatedly requested that PEPFAR policies go away. The affirmative's PEPFAR Part 2 would aggravate international AIDS groups, and the United States needs this cooperation for NATO assistance in Iraq and Afghanistan. Our D point is the Somalian proxy war. The Global Health proposal focuses on PEPFAR countries such as Ethiopia. Moreover, Ethiopia was the host for the only U.S.-operated community health worker program in the region. The U.S. will give aid to Ethiopia, which is a PEPFAR country, but will not give aid to Eritrea, which is a Muslim country. Ethiopia will perceive this favoritism and international slight of Eritrea as a slight that its efforts in Somalia are tacitly condoned, and the African-Christian war in Somalia against the Islamic Middle Eastern influence in Eritrea is okay. And since 2006, Ethiopia and Eritrea have been waging a proxy war. And the United States has actually withdrawn its support of the military and threatened sanctions. But if the affirmative project continues, it's going to be a gesture of goodwill towards Ethiopia and undermine the current message and risk an escalation of war. And this war will cause hundreds and thousands of deaths, catastrophic refugee flows, and the destabilization of the region would exacerbate the disease spread and further alienate the international community. So our third major point is that the World Health Organization counterplan alone is the best policy. The Physicians for Human Rights says that the World Health Organization efforts to develop an international human resources database should receive the full support of the international community, and that wealthy WHO member states should provide the WHO with necessary support to carry out this and other WHO activities. The affirmative has never offered nor suggested a combination of both policies, and the affirmative proposal and negative counterproposal are the only options available. Because only the World Health Organization and the Global Fund can approach the HIV/AIDS crisis from a global perspective, and because only the WHO and the Global Fund can provide a sufficient amount of logistical support, the negative counterproposal is the most desirable policy option in today's round. Furthermore, the negative counterproposal implemented alone avoids the disadvantages that simultaneous action would incur. The redundancies and confusion caused by PEPFAR or the affirmative's PEPFAR Part 2 would end. Specifically, American-trained community health workers or global health workers would not be allowed to contradict WHO education programs and WHO drug treatment programs. The counterproposal disallows the president or any other interest group from influencing public health assistance. And by eliminating conflicting and redundant and isolated U.S. HIV initiatives, the U.S. would bolster relations with the European Union. In conclusion, we have provided 4 major reasons to support the negative. Thank you.
Prior to the beginning of questions from our panel, we will have a brief session where the contestants will question each other. We will begin this, it's a 4-question exchange, and we will begin with an affirmative question for the negative.
Thanks. Your counter-proposal would involve the disbanding of PEPFAR, which you claim to be very faith-based. The reason is because President Bush and Mark Dybul, the director, have specific ideologies in the prevention of AIDS because of these faith-based. Why would disbanding PEPFAR prevent Bush and Dybul from just not changing the mandate of, say, the Global Fund, or just creating a new organization to have these same faith-based ideologies within these programs?
Okay, so first of all, our counter plan is not going to create a global health service fund in any way, so the same thing wouldn't happen. And because our counter plan proposal is to actually divert all funding through the World Health Organization, it's an apolitical international organization where the U.S. political influence cannot touch it. So when we disband PEPFAR, we're essentially removing the U.S. politics and the faith-based initiatives, etc., from the equation.
Okay. Question from the negative for the affirmative. Andrew?
Yes.
Okay.
Colleyville. The only author advocate you cite who says the words global health service, Dr. Fitzhugh Mullen, proposes, and I quote, "The committee proposes initial deployment of 150 U.S. federal government global health service corps professionals in 15 PEPFAR-focused countries, only 12 of which are in sub-Saharan Africa. 150 professionals, 15 countries. That's 10 workers per country. There is a shortage of 1.5 million workers. How do you even put a dent in the African or the global HIV health worker crisis?"
Affirmative?
The proposal which Fitzhugh Mullen talks about is actually the pilot program for the Global Health Service. He was the one who proposed it, and it's basically a smaller program to test if it would be successful, and if the Global Health Service is successful, then it would be expanded. We defend an increase in PEPFAR assistance in the status quo of $50 billion. This is a desirable increase, and while it has not happened, the affirmative team does endorse this, but with a focus on infrastructure building and the training of local health workers. Additionally, the negative makes the argument that 3 of the 15 PEPFAR-focused countries, it's outside of sub-Saharan Africa. However, in the affirmative plan text, it specifically says that the GHS would only be set up in the PEPFAR-focused countries in sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you. And 2 more. There would be an affirmative question for the negative, and that needs to be either Andrew or Landon. Landon, go ahead.
Your counter-proposal appears to simply advocate that the World Health Organization should do a plan similar to that proposed by us, instead of the United States acting, with the United States fully funding this World Health Organization initiative. However, given that the United States closely cooperates with the World Health Organization, as it's a member state, and that Benatar and Fox indicate that the United States is a powerful cultural model, and given that the United States has a history of humanitarian efforts in sub-Saharan Africa, including the Peace Corps, the U.S. Department for International Aid, and PEPFAR, whereas the World Health Organization has no such record, why would it be best to simply adopt the counter-proposal as opposed to having both the World Health Organization and the United States work together?
DJ or Satish?
Okay. Actually, the World Health Organization has been acting specifically in Africa and the entire world longer than the United States PEPFAR. Before PEPFAR has ever happened in 2003, before that, the United States routed all of its funding for HIV assistance and any other type of medical assistance to the WHO and the international community, and that's what we would do. Specifically, the World Health Organization would be better than PEPFAR because it's apolitical. It doesn't have the same political charges that the United States has when it gives aid. Additionally, the World Health Organization is better at what it does. The PEPFAR just hasn't had the experience. It isn't given the clout that the World Health Organization uses. We indicate in the constructive specifically that the World Health Organization is better at evaluating drugs such as ARVs and is also better at finding educational policies, for instance, partner reduction rather than abstinence only.
DJ, a question for Andrew.
Colleyville, given that your own author advocate, Mr. Paul Davis, admits that your program could be implemented successfully through either the United States federal government or through the WHO, and I quote from Davis, utilizing existing OGAC or WHO training modules, Global Health Corps could greatly extend program reach and benefit by rapidly accrediting village-level workers. And given the fact that another one of your sources, Dr. Delano Dovlo, a physician and specialist in human resources for health in Accra, Ghana, also says that the WHO substitute health workers can be trained by the World Health Organization, and since there's so many problems associated with U.S. implementation, and since your own advocate admits that the counterplan is a viable alternative, why wouldn't it be better to implement the affirmative proposal through the World Health Organization? Secondly, do you have any authors who compare WHO administration to PEPFAR administration and conclude against the WHO?
Andrew?
To answer your first question, I don't think any of our authors necessarily state that the WHO needs to act in lieu of the United States acting. I think that they would advocate a comprehensive action that would include the United States action as well as action by the World Health Organization. Also, our authors are primarily writing about the United States taking a particular action in the context of establishing a global health service. While it's true that the World Health Organization might be able to mitigate the effect of it, we've outlined specific situations or specific instances in the first affirmative as to how PEPFAR is superior because it's expanded access to ARVs for numerous people, and we've defended the ABC approach that you say are problems associated with United States policy. You say that you ask also if we have any authors that are comparative on this question. We do have multiple authors who state that previous WHO initiatives, like the 3x5 initiative that they instituted in 2005, were woefully inadequate in terms of trying to help people in Africa in this regard.
Thank you very much. We will now begin a question and answer period with our panel. And we will, of course, try to keep the questions as balanced as possible between the affirmative and the negative, and we'll sort all that out at the end and try to even things up as we have to. But we are ready for those questions. If any member of the panel has a question they would like to direct to either side.
I'd like to ask a simple-minded question to both teams. Could a member of each team please inform me how much additional funding your proposal will provide and what the source of that funding will be? Just an exact number and the additional funding that will be provided in each of the proposals and the source of that funding.
The preference for who should answer that first, Dr. Sexton?
Affirmative started.
Affirmative.
Okay, well, first, the affirmative is an endorsement of the current PEPFAR authorization bill that's before Congress. This increase hasn't happened yet, but Congress is proposing that we have a $60 billion increase in, $50 billion increase in HIV/AIDS assistance. The affirmative takes a stance on that increase should focus on some of the certain PEPFAR goals that exist in the status quo, but they should also have a much bigger emphasis on infrastructure. So we are advocating that increase in $50 billion in assistance that would be appropriated by Congress through how that assistance is normally appropriated. I assume taxes would be levied.
Just let me, I'm sorry to ask a follow-up on this, but I just want to be very clear on this. Is that an annual increase, and does it all go to sub-Saharan Africa?
Well, it's not $50 billion annually. It's $50 billion over 5 years, I believe. And some of those funds would be not to sub-Saharan Africa. The vast majority of those funds are to sub-Saharan Africa. We defend the increase in funds to sub-Saharan.
The negative would like to answer.
Yeah. We'd provide $13 billion, $8 billion specifically for the creation of a health worker program by the WHO, of the World Health Organization, and $5 billion shifted out of PEPFAR by getting rid of PEPFAR to the World Health Organization for whatever task they'd want to do with it. The $5 billion is coming from ending the new increase that would happen for PEPFAR, the $50 billion over actually 10, not 5, but 10 years. So $5 billion per year. We redirect that to the WHO, and the $8 billion is just a raw increase out of the Department of State budget. specifically USAID.
Thank you. Questions from the panel? Mr. One.
I'd like to ask a similar question, but I'd like to ask it about the actual healthcare workers, because you have the funds and how you're increasing the funding. But there seems to be some lingering questions about how many actual workers will be trained that then will work in sub-Saharan Africa. Because I heard a need by the negative for 1.5 million, I think, and I heard that you would create 2.4, but that's several countries. So I think I'd like the negative to first talk about that math and how many are actually going to end up in Africa, and maybe the affirmative will also want to address how many actual workers will be created through your plan.
Thank you for the question, Mr. One. Yes, we do state that there is a shortage of 1.5 million health workers in sub-Saharan Africa. The counterplan would provide for 2.4 spread around the world and the other areas that need attention as well. We isolate areas like South America, Russia, China, India as the next hotspots that are going to develop into AIDS crises. And our hope is that in addition to the 1.5 million needed in sub-Saharan Africa, these workers will go to the other hotspots in the world and will focus on a more global coordinated effort as opposed to a simple piecemeal solution in sub-Saharan Africa alone. So to answer your question directly, there's 1.5 million sub-Saharan Africa and 900,000 in the emerging hotspots which were listed in the constructive.
Affirmative.
To be honest, like raw specific numbers, not very explicit within it, but our Mullen evidence talks about how we'll be able to send several thousand of individuals to this. The Mullen evidence goes on to talk about how this would create, in essence, a multiplier effect in which other like international NGOs and other countries would see the U.S. taking this stance and see the shift from a focus on simply funding to one focus on the provision of health workers and individuals and American volunteers to show more face-to-face connections with these individuals. And as a result, this multiplier effect would in essence occur. And I guess based upon this initial sending of several thousand, based upon like a preliminary diagnosis of the conflict in Africa, or I guess the situation in Africa, more people will be allocated as necessary.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Mr. Trott?
There seems to be a clear disagreement between you as to how effective the PEPFAR program has been so far. And you both referred to the ABC philosophy of the program and obviously took very different views. I think we need to hear more clear argument, more detail as to, in fact, whether this program, especially the abstinence aspect of it, which seems to be the controversial one, has proved to be effective or ineffective. Now, I think because there was a somewhat more detailed argument about that from the negative side, maybe we can start with the affirmative side, explaining how it is that this ABC program, and specifically the abstinence aspect, has proved to be an effective way of fighting AIDS.
Recently, a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and ranking member of the Subcommittee on African Global Health, Chris Smith, made a testimonial talking about the benefits of having this ABC approach. He talked about how it was the only scientific method to actually work, and he also cited statistics which show that the ABC approach does work. We cite evidence from his testimonial talking about how recent data from Zimbabwe and Kenya mirror the success of Uganda's ABC approach, and how in Zimbabwe from 1998 to 2003, using the ABC approach, HIV prevalence rates fell 23% and by a remarkable 49% among women. And also in Kenya, the rates dropped 2%. And the successes were not achieved by condom distribution as much as they were by a change in sexual behavior. Additionally, a recent consensus on the statement by The Lancet was endorsed by 150 AIDS experts, including Nobel laureates.
Negative? Who wants to take that question? Okay.
That's a great question. And well, the affirmative claims that PEPFAR is a tried and true organization. However, history proves that PEPFAR's policies, especially their abstinence, their ABC policies, have empirically failed. In places like Uganda, Barry, who works for AVERT, who is it's an AIDS organization, cites that rates in Uganda were dropping throughout the 1990s. Then in 2003, when PEPFAR made it a focus of its initiatives, rates skyrocketed up to 17% again, and then the affirmative cites people from the United States federal government, and obviously anyone who works for PEPFAR is going to say that PEPFAR is effective and the ABC policy is effective. However, there's two problems with the statistics. One, he worked for PEPFAR. Two, he cites statistics from 98 to 2003. PEPFAR was not in existence till 2003. Barry, on the other hand, makes an analysis of Uganda after 2003, after PEPFAR came in, meaning that PEPFAR has been proven ineffective.
Additional questions? Yes, Mr. Gale.
Let's continue on that for a quick second. Uganda is the only country I've heard either team mention that's got a before and after rate, which is to say beforehand, during presumably the PETCAR era, it was doing X, and then afterwards, during the WHO approach, it was doing Y. So ABC versus condoms, or maybe it's the opposite. What is happening in Zimbabwe and Kenya with the same kind of analysis? Put another way, do we have evidence that actually compares the same country using both approaches? Because it seems that just describing what statistics are in a given city doesn't provide the right comparison.
Can I take that?
Why don't we, both ways, why don't you start? Sure.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. And if you're looking for another country model, one of our primary sources is from Helen Epstein, who is the director of the Foreign Foundation, and she did a study on HIV/AIDS in Africa, specifically Botswana and Uganda. And you've heard the story about Uganda, but Botswana is the other opposite end of the example, where Botswana had a program very similar to PEPFAR initiated, and unlike Uganda, it was a very stable government with a successful medical infrastructure, etc. But it was very unsuccessful because the policies that they implemented, it was very, abstinence was promoted, condoms were stigmatized, and because all of this, it just clashed with the culture, and it actually was very ineffective. And Botswana had the highest rates in Africa at the time, which was the early 90s. And at the same time, Uganda, which it was being compared to, did not have PEPFAR. It didn't have PEPFAR aid. It was a community-based. It was community-based aid where the health workers would each talk to the individuals, and depending on what the community would respond with, they would have that type of aid. And those two policies were conflicting and showed directly how PEPFAR caused HIV rates to skyrocket. Thank you.
Landon, would you mind taking that question for the affirmative?
Well, in addition to citing Kenya and Zimbabwe as instances where the ABC method has worked effectively, that piece of evidence also indicates that Uganda, while following this approach, which Zimbabwe and Kenya mirrored, when it followed this approach, it actually reduced the prevalence of HIV/AIDS, regardless of whether it's from 1997 to 2003 or not. We're just saying that in the past, Uganda also implemented these ABC approaches, and it resulted in a decrease in HIV/AIDS prevalence. Furthermore, it's interesting that they brought up Botswana, since Botswana has had one of the highest HIV/AIDS prevalence rates in the status quo, and currently the PEPFAR initiatives are working to bring it down.
The article, the testimonial, I guess not, never mind.
Additional questions from our panel? Ms. Wade.
I'm interested in the argument about the healthcare workers staying in Africa, and there's an argument going on that there will be a group that is less elitist. There's an argument going on that they'll stay in their areas, but that this is in fairly serious tension with the brain drain. I'd just like you all to clarify each side on that question.
We're all even, so anybody on either team.
Actually, the reason why the WHO specifically and this global initiative is going to be so effective at countering brain drain is that we address both the supply and demand of these health workers by acting outside of Africa and addressing the health worker shortages in these places. It gives less incentive for these health workers to emigrate out of Africa, to leave and go to these other places where they're in demand. And that means when they can both get a higher salary in Africa and there's no demand for them outside, there's no reason for them to emigrate, and we can keep health professionals in Africa by doing that.
So there's no job opportunity.
There's less job opportunities,
Okay.
but
All right.
maybe they could find one.
There are numerous reasons why the approach proposed by the affirmative is superior to the current policies regarding brain drain. First, a global health service, as you pointed out, would focus primarily on the retention of community health workers in rural areas. Developed nations are less inclined to try and, I guess, recruit these health workers because they haven't been trained in medical schools. They've just been trained by U.S. health workers. Also, they're more inclined to stay in these countries because they have cultural ties to the region. Statistics show that most African health professionals would like to stay in Africa, but as long as there aren't crippling incentives that as long as there aren't incentives that make them essentially leave. Also, we have raw statistics that back up our approach. For instance, in Tanzania, 75% of community health workers were retained in their country because of the reasons outlined above.
Okay, so they're trained by the United States.
Yes.
Okay. Is there a certification process? Is there, because there's also arguments going on about the quality of care and distribution of care, and I'm wondering if there's a link between the quality of their training and the quality of the services that are delivered.
Well, we are not we're not giving them shoddy training. We're sending, very professional American doctors, people like that who can go to Africa. They are experts in HIV/AIDS assistance, and they impart all the knowledge that they possibly can that's feasible onto those people. So it's not like we're not training them well. It's just that they're not being trained in like medical schools in urban areas in Africa, which is what we cite as one of the reasons that Western nations are inclined to try and recruit these people.
Before we move to another question, would someone on the negative like to respond to that just for about 30 seconds?
All right. One of the affirmative advocates, Garrett, actually addresses the reasons why indigenous workers may leave or stay, and she discusses several push or pull factors, including factors like war, like political instability, and also making a living wage. And where the affirmative barely provides enough money to train these workers, and because there's still demand in other regions, whether it's in other countries in sub-Saharan Africa or other countries outside of sub-Saharan Africa, there's more incentive for them to leave than with the negative counterproposal, where once again all the supply and demand is in equilibrium. Where is it? Also, with one of our author advocates, Marguerite Rose, says that when the U.S. trains them, they would come here, but when the World Health Organization trains them, it would be like these community health workers, they're not being trained in medical schools either, so it would be around the same level, but we address the actual demands of it.
Mr. Brewer has a question.
The debate has been excellent, thank you. And it seems to come down to correct me if I'm wrong, a difference over who's going to provide and keep healthcare workers in the targeted area. Both sides agree with that? Does the affirmative agree that there is a need for 1.5 million healthcare professionals now, as the negative contends, in sub-Saharan Africa to combat this problem?
I mean, sure, as many healthcare workers as possible would always be great, but it's kind of hard to define a distinction as to why maybe like 1.3 million would be different from 1.5. We'd always state that as many as possible would be the best, but it's just hard to find a tangible reason as to why maybe a couple hundred more would be uniquely better based upon either side. So sometimes it's just a weird difference to try and calculate, it is a reason to vote for either team as a differential reason. But yes, as many workers as always best as possible for alleviating such a bad epidemic in Africa.
Well, the negative contends that their program will meet the need. They'll focus and target their money that they will send through the World Health Organization in such a way that they will meet the need. They'll train and attempt to retain that amount of professionals who are healthcare workers. Did you agree that their program does that?
Sure, it might actually do that, but we would state that this new $50 billion increase by PEPFAR that's been authorized over the next 10 years would be a much preferable source to do so, because over these 10 years we would have $50 billion as compared to the $13 billion they support, which would be a reason as to why we would be able to engage with more health professionals. Furthermore, just because the WHO necessarily has the capability to do that is not a reason to necessarily neglect U.S. action. We simply state that we should be able to have both policies to address it. There's not a reason as to why the World Health Organization can't work with U.S., given that the U.S. is actually a member state of the WHO.
Well, Alex, you or one of your partners helped me with this. I thought in response to an earlier question you said that your program would annually recruit several thousand healthcare professionals. Is that what your plan does?
What I stated earlier is when Mr. One asked for a specific number of how many workers, we said that initially this pilot program would be expanded to several thousand people, and then based upon a diagnosis of the need after this, I guess, initial wave of professionals was sent, we would diagnose the condition and see how many would be necessary to send using this $50 billion increase over time as, I guess, funding for such an increase.
And so give me some comfort. How, if we vote for the affirmative plan, do we know that you believe that that plan meets the need that you both agreed on?
I'm sorry, you said how can I comfort you that this would be...
Yeah, give me some comfort that your plan...
yes, this PEPFAR increase has been a drastic increase in public health assistance unmatched by any previous U.S. foreign assistance initiative. We would say that this unrivaled amount of sum that's been not matched by any other nation or international organization like the WHO. The WHO does not have such like a $50 billion increase it's authorized. We would say that over these 10 years, this $50,000 would be a very large sum to use for funding the health professionals. Additionally, the WHO doesn't really necessarily establish infrastructure. The WHO doesn't actually enact policies, just oversees policies.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Brewer, would you like to address any part of that question to the negative, or are we ready for...
Well, other than giving them a free shot, what do you say in response to Alex? Will his plan meet the need?
All right, thanks for the opportunity, Mr. Brewer. The affirmative advocates sending several thousand at a time, and even with their training, they're never going to get into the millions, which all our evidence indicates is the necessary number, even if it's 1.3 to 1.8. The fact is it's in the millions of workers. They're simply sending thousands at a time isn't going to solve. Additionally, the affirmative ignores the pull factor. They're supplying more to sub-Saharan Africa, but they ignore the international pull, where workers can actually earn more overseas, which is what the counterplan aims to stop by focusing on a global solution and addressing the other problem areas where community health or these global health workers would be sent. We're able to keep local workers in their own areas as opposed to having the stories where Nigerian workers, the amount of Nigerian doctors in New York exceeds the number in Nigeria itself. So by providing Vietnamese workers in Vietnam and Nigerian workers in Nigeria, we're able to stop the massive emigration, thereby increasing global numbers.
Thank you very much. Another question, Dr. Sexton.
I guess I want to tackle the same general issue from a little bit of a different angle. First, let me echo the comment that the debate's been excellent so far, and I'm very impressed. But I'm sitting here thinking to myself, I've heard some pretty compelling arguments about what weaknesses exist both with PEPFAR and with the WHO. It seems to me that the bad news is that each organization seems to have some underlying weaknesses that could theoretically undercut the effectiveness of the various proposals. And given that, and given the magnitude of the problem that we all seem to agree upon that's outlined in the first speech, I'm sort of wondering, I'm sitting here wondering, what don't we need to throw the whole kitchen sink at this issue before we have millions upon millions more dead people in Africa? And so I'm interested from hearing from both teams about what you see as the issue of compatibility or incompatibility as to between the two plans that are on the table. Can they work together or can they not?
Actually, that's a great question. They shouldn't work together, is our contention, specifically because most of the problems that we've been seeing, the surge in AIDS rates in multiple countries, is due to PEPFAR. For instance, Stephen Lewis, who is the UN Special Envoy regarding HIV/AIDS to Africa, specifically heavily criticizes PEPFAR because of its promotion of ABCs and its blatant disregard of the international consensus on what the best thing to do regarding the problem is. Additionally, he specifically advocates that the United States and other member states of the World Health Organization and the international community support the World Health Organization as well as the Global Fund in their effort against AIDS and stop operating these unilateral initiatives. Additionally, Helen Epstein and Daniel Halperin, both specifically, they're both PhDs and they both study the phenomenon of the spread of AIDS in Africa. They note that the ABC method that PEPFAR uses is horrible and that partner reduction which was the Ugandan message of ABCs. That was much better at stopping the spread of HIV.
Affirmative?
There's no reason why the U.S. and the WHO couldn't send aid at the same time, and like having cooperation would solve the best. As Dr. Deatherage said, we're throwing money at the problem right now. The plan would functionally change the focus of where this money would be going. And having health professionals is only one half of solving the problem. The other half is actually setting up infrastructure, right? The negative team, the negative proposal through the WHO wouldn't increase infrastructure. So having the WHO train a bunch of doctors would lead to a plethora of trained workers, but they would have no way of distributing the ARVs. So in the end, it wouldn't solve as well. Additionally, the US is a cultural model, as our Benatar and Fox piece of evidence states, the United States is the country with the most potential to favorably influence global health trends. They have the capacity to act on this matter, and they have the moral obligation to exemplify and implement values in action that are contingent upon solving the HIV/AIDS crisis in Africa.
President Sexton, I think you had a question.
I'm going to just ask a predicate fact question before I get to my main question. I just want to make sure I understand something. I thought I had it in focus, and then it kind of got lost for me, at least. So now I'm hearing, going back to the very first question I asked at the beginning, that the affirmative team is going to increase the funding both for infrastructure and personnel by an annual figure of $5 billion a year, totaling $50 billion over 10 years. And I thought I heard the negative team say that for their counterproposal, which of course is broader than sub-Saharan Africa, they were going to take that putative $50 billion, $5 billion a year, $5 billion a year, not $5 billion total, $5 billion a year. They were going to add some $8 billion they were going to get from someplace they didn't specify. So they were going to throw $13 billion a year at this issue. Am I right, negative? That you're going to add $13 billion, not all of which will go to sub-Saharan. Okay, so, got it. I'm now going to put my cards on the table and give each team a chance to respond to me. Now, I may be Sandra Day O'Connor and the swing judge, or I may be William Rehnquist in the 90s and way out there and completely irrelevant. So you got to figure out whether you agree with where I'm putting as to where these other people sit. Because if you answer me the way you think you're going to get my vote, you may lose all of them, okay? So as I peel the onion, it all comes down to this. We got a negative that is saying, just said very eloquently, the United States approach, as implemented in faith-based programs like PEPFAR, is toxic. We want to purge it from the system. We want to turn everything over to the WHO. Anything that includes the PEPFAR approach, the ABC approach, is bound to fail because it's toxic. And that's the fundamentals of their argument. They can't argue anymore you're not making a big increase or the other things I brought up, to me, okay? On the other hand, you got an affirmative that's saying, ABC works some of the time. There'll be a lot of other stuff going on. We're not against multilateralism. We're focusing on sub-Saharan Africa and bringing the United States in. They even use words like moral authority, which connotes maybe a nice little ABC endorsement. Okay? But they say there's something else that's important going on here that you folks haven't even talked about with your $13 billion, and that's infrastructure. It's not just personnel, it's infrastructure. That's why they're taking a more gradual approach to the deployment of the personnel in answer to Brother Brewer's question. So for me, it's a question of, is the United States toxic? Affirmative. And to the negative, it's a question of, where's the infrastructure backup for all of this, even with the $8 billion you've introduced a year as a deus ex machina, about which they haven't commented at all. They're kind of giving you that money for free.
Thanks for the question. Can I direct this one, Lyndon? It's sort of your turn. Would you take that for the affirmative? And if I could get Andrew to answer that question for the negative, that'd be great. All right, a minute apiece. Lyndon, go ahead.
Well, obviously the affirmative would not say that the United States is toxic, but even if it were like detrimental to the HIV/AIDS crisis in Africa right now, there would be no reason why President Bush and his Dibin would not just establish another organization that would utilize or implement these faith-based operations all over again. Like, if they say that we just disband PEPFAR, they don't provide a reason why President Bush wouldn't just initiate another PEPFAR version 3.0 that would just do this all over again. And basically, we're the only option that the United States has to make PEPFAR effective through the establishment of infrastructure and through the training of local health workers to treat and prevent this disease and combat it.
Andrew, for the negative.
And that's a really important question. The counterplan would provide for the same kind of infrastructure that the affirmative provides for. The WHO recommendation that we base our advocacy upon specifically calls for infrastructure to support the increase in health workers, because you're not just going to be able to throw health workers at the problem and not provide them with the infrastructure and the support they need. That would be futile. So we do provide that, and we specifically, the WHO has said that they would provide that same kind of infrastructure with that $8 billion additionally to the funds that they would provide as well that we also use. My opponent has just stated that a WHO program, as per the counterproposal, would have the same kind of ABC and the political motivations as current policies. However, that is not true. We take the president's hand out of the cookie jar, so to speak. We take the president's hand out of current policy and make all the decision-making up to these international organizations. And our evidence indicates that this is the best way to do. Our Lewis evidence is the best way to go.
Mr. Prentice, do you have a question for either team?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. First, let me say that it has been a very edifying discussion, and I appreciate your diligence. And let me also say that given that President Sexton is wearing a baseball hat, I want to throw you a curve. I want you to think about the next issue facing us, which is a pandemic flu situation. I want you to think about the foundation for each of your program and explain to us why your foundation would work better in the next iteration of viruses that come our way.
Do you have a preference for who answers that first, Mr. Prentice, or should I?
Either one.
Either one. We'll start with the negative because we went the opposite direction last time. So I think we're all even except for Satish, if you'll set this one out. Anybody else on the negative?
Well, certainly the WHO, the World Health Organization, would be better equipped to address a global problem such as you cited the flu epidemic that we are facing in the future, because it has worked on this in the past, whereas PEPFAR is the President's emergency plan for AIDS relief. It's specific to HIV/AIDS. So doctors provided through the WHO could theoretically be rerouted to fight such viruses in the future. Additionally, we sent a global solution, meaning it could go to places in China and in Southeast Asia where the flu epidemic has been most acute. And additionally, our Ismail evidence that we cite discusses how PEPFAR refuses to use generic drugs, which have been proven to be equally as effective and cost much exponentially less money, whereas PEPFAR has refused to do so. The WHO uses these generic drugs and they use them to the most effectiveness. PEPFAR refuses to do so because they're intertwined with political agendas and supporting big pharmaceutical companies, and they're profiteering off the AIDS crisis and disease in general.
Affirmative?
Well, first they suggest that the WHO would be more comprehensive because it would aid other areas besides sub-Saharan Africa. However, there's no analysis as to how that answers the fact that the United States federal government already has substantive aid programs in place in Asia that is tackling the avian flu pandemic right now. There's a massive response to avian flu in the status quo. However, it's just a fact that that response hasn't extended far to Africa, where avian flu outbreaks have existed in places like Nigeria. Argument is that if we prove that we are better for building health infrastructure in those regions, then we can address the place that is the weak link in the global surveillance network, and that is Africa, because it is most at risk for an avian flu outbreak simply because of HIV/AIDS, things like that, that enhance susceptibility. They make arguments about generic drugs. However, there have been recent reforms by PEPFAR that allow them to use generic drugs. It also doesn't apply to avian flu because there is no vaccination for avian flu. Antiretroviral drugs are an irrelevant discussion.
Mr. One.
It's situations like this that there's a lot of pride looking at so many National Forensic League members. You guys have been excellent. It seems to be all about the math today, so let's go back to math just a little bit. The permutation seems very important in this debate, okay? Whether or not we could do both, or whether or not, as you say it in your opening speech, the U.S. can't touch it. And I want to get to that, because if we do the negatives plan, I believe you said the U.S. then would not be able to touch that money. So the proposal is to cut the United States out of the process. If I do the math right, 3/5 of your $13 billion would go to Africa to help get the workers and train the workers. So speak to me briefly, negative, and maybe the affirmative will want to respond, how if $8 billion of the money you already have said would go, 3/5 of it were spent on Africa, and $5 billion a year were spent to allow the U.S. to stay in the loop, why that would not be the right thing to do.
BJ or Jenny?
All right, thank you for the question, Mr. One. We actually have a few reasons why the U.S. spending money so it can stay involved in these practices would be bad. For instance, all AIDS efforts go through the Office of the Global AIDS Coordinator, whose director is Mr. Mark Dybel. Mr. Dybel has historically been a proponent of both the ABC model and faith-based initiatives, which all our evidence indicates are atrocious and harm the scenario in Africa. And that kind of influence in the World Health Organization is what would take it down. Additionally, World Health Organization action by itself would be better for the disadvantages listed in the negative constructive. For instance, our Lewis evidence indicates that the EU has specifically asked that PEPFAR be disbanded. It's countering the EU's own practices and its AIDS assistance programs in sub-Saharan Africa and other places. So the combination of the two plans would be to the detriment of the public health as a whole because of decreased EU cooperation. We would not be able to count on them for support, decreasing their funds to the World Health Organization, as well as countering efforts by both sides.
Affirmative. Would you like to respond to that? Pretty much, probably Alex or Jonathan or Landon.
Sure, I'll go. Even if you adopt the negative proposal and theoretically Bush's hands out of the cookie jar, that's be related to PEPFAR. It seems unlikely that Bush would just no longer increase foreign assistance. It seems like political fallout from PEPFAR being dismantled and Bush just almost, in essence, freezing foreign aid would yield bad ramifications, and that Bush would be almost forced to necessitate foreign assistance by potentially building another new program. So even if this $5 billion from PEPFAR was no longer in Bush's hands, he could still get reauthorization for other programs to create a new initiative that would still align faith-based programs. So it seems that some kind of U.S. assistance in the foreign arena is still kind of inevitable. And as for the European relations, the European Union has also taken great steps to increase foreign assistance related to doctors. It seems unlikely the European Union would say no to the U.S. trying to also ameliorate this HIV/AIDS crisis. And there's also not necessarily a definitive reason they give as to why this decline in European relations would be bad.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
I want to go back to this cultural question, which I think both sides are dancing around, which is to say, are we to some extent having an argument U.S. good versus U.S. evil? Now, the affirmative side has said several times, without really explaining quite what it means, that the United States is a cultural model. But when you've been challenged on the question of American involvement and whether in fact it might turn out to be in some sense toxic, you've all said the equivalent of, well, maybe it is and maybe it's not, but you can't stop the United States. Now that's clearly not an answer to the question that you yourself have raised by saying the U.S. is a cultural model, and you've talked about, as John said, the sense of moral obligation that the United States perhaps by its very nature has. So I'd like you to explain what you mean, because I assume you mean it not just as a descriptive fact, but as a morally positive fact, that the United States is a cultural model, because presumably that's an important part of the inherent advantage that the United States has. And maybe what something that the negative side can say is your problem with the United States specifically, or is your problem that you think any one country is a worse provider of this kind of care than a multilateral organization, whether the provider were the United States or some other country?
Let's go with either Jonathan or Landon on the affirmative, and then we'll get the negative in a minute. I think, Jenny, I think you're up on that one. Okay? So either Jonathan or Landon.
Their argument as to why the United States action is, I guess, toxic is primarily a denouncement of the ABC approach, which we have already provided adequate support for, talking about how recent testimonial, which postdates their evidence, talks about how most people do agree that the ABC approach is effective. Additionally, our cultural ties argument comes from the fact that the U.S. already has lots of programs set up in Africa, and they have the expertise on public health, as proven by the fact that they have set up bird flu prevention programs in parts of Asia. And they also have the Peace Corps, right? However, the WHO doesn't have any programs in Africa right now. Additionally, Bush recently made a trip to PEPFAR-focused countries such as it was Tanzania, Kenya as well, and Namibia, talking about global health issues with the African leaders in those countries, which are some of the cultural ties that we're talking about.
I'm sorry, if I could ask again, I still don't know what you mean by a cultural model. In what sense is the United States a cultural model?
As stated in our affirmative paper, or speech rather, the United States is the only global hegemon in the current international order. It is the only superpower in the world right now, and it has the ability to have this bandwagoning effect, as stated by Bradley Thayer, where the United States can form coalitions of like-minded states and influence other states to encourage action on these issues as well. Furthermore, the United States, as stated before, has a unique relation with Africa. It has empirically done large amounts to assist Africa, and as stated by our Benatar and Fox evidence, I believe, it would have political and economic ramifications throughout the world, because if the Global Health Service proposed by the affirmative were to work, then it would spread to other places.
Conveniently enough, if we let Jenny respond to that will even it all up, and then we'll have our rebuttal statements. Jenny?
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Traub, and thank you to all the judges. It's been an honor to have this panel listen to our debate. Now, we would directly refute what they call this cultural modeling, and it is our contention that this cultural modeling that the U.S. assumes is poisonous to us. One of our advantages in the negative constructive was that we are being alienated internationally. The United States is not going to actually create a bandwagon effect and find like-minded states, but rather the World Health Organization, the European Union, they've already created a coalition, and they essentially disagree with us. The European Union, for example, in the Kaiser Daily Report, has already actually asked us publicly at the World AIDS Day to please disband PEPFAR, because the policies that the United States forces upon the Africans go against their normal beliefs and actually confuses them. The messages where the World Health Organization and all the other international donors have been saying condoms are okay, condoms do prevent AIDS spread, and the United States actually goes against it and starts to press on abstinence, and in many cultures is hazardous to them. It goes completely against them. Because of this international alienation, we would directly refute that. Thank you.
We will conclude this debate with final rebuttal statements, first by the negative, 5 minutes.
I'd like to thank everybody for listening to today's debate. Today's debate is a question of policies, one that would institute a unilateral regional solution and the other a comprehensive and globally orchestrated effort. The affirmative plan would provide $100 million specifically for the creation of these health workers. That's from their own advocate, Mr. Mullen, to address this 1.5 million health worker shortage in Africa. The affirmative's primary advocate notes that the Global Health Service would send only 150 doctors to Africa, while the negative would have the World Health Organization administer a worldwide program to train and employ health professionals numbering the exact 1.5 million health workers needed in Africa and the 2.4 needed globally. The WHO would address HIV across the globe, including South and Southeast Asia, Russia, and China, the upcoming hotspots in HIV and AIDS prevention. This debate is going to come down to 3 issues. First is that the WHO is the better organization to operate a health worker training program. 2 is that a U.S.-administered program would smack of the same unilateralism and inadequacy that plagues PEPFAR. And 3 is that the international community has voiced their opinion repeatedly and has asked the United States to stop PEPFAR. On the World Health Organization, it's the ideal venue for a global health worker program. The World Health Organization would address the entire globe and the worldwide shortage of 2.4 million health workers. Because the WHO is internationally recognized and apolitical, the WHO would be better received than the politically charged U.S. PEPFAR and similar programs. Furthermore, the WHO would be better able to train health professionals because the World Health Organization chooses education styles, prevention efforts, and medicines based on their efficacy, not on a political agenda. Paul Davis and Delano Dovio, both affirmative authors, conclude that the WHO would be just as good, if not better, than the U.S. PEPFAR. Specifically, the negative points out the World Health Organization would be bad, but the evidence that they cite on this actually concludes in favor of the WHO. First of all, Roger Bate actually concludes that the World Health Organization notes that PEPFAR actually tries to direct the funds allocated to the WHO. He notes that the 3x5 program administered by the World Health Organization was misdirected because of PEPFAR's mismanagement of these funds and it trying to get these funds to support ABCs. Specifically on the question of a combination of WHO and PEPFAR action would be bad, specifically because when you have this combination, PEPFAR is still going to exist and it's going to be able to basically get access to the cookie jar, as Andrew put it. And that's going to be bad for a couple of reasons. First of all, is it forces the World Health Organization to use faith-based groups, which have empirically not worked in Africa. Like we've said, the AIDS rates in Uganda shot up to 17% because of these faith-based and abstinence-only prohibition or types of education. Additionally, it means that the World Health Organization and PEPFAR can only use American-bought drugs, which are 6 to 8 times more expensive than the leading competitors in the international market. Next, on white, PEPFAR specifically is bad. All U.S. HIV assistance is coordinated by the Office of the Global AIDS Coordinator. Mark R. Dybel, who holds this office, would control the implementation of a global health service. Dr. Dybel has repeatedly voiced his support for faith-based initiatives and abstinence promotion. Dr. Mullen, the affirmative author, proposes that the GHS be incorporated into PEPFAR and the GHS only target PEPFAR nations. Again, Stephen Lewis, the UN envoy on HIV/AIDS and thus the international consensus on HIV/AIDS, has heavily criticized PEPFAR. The EU, as well, has repeatedly voiced discontent with PEPFAR because it only buys American drugs and restricts the promotion of condoms and non-abstinence-only education. Moreover, PEPFAR has empirically increased HIV rates over the last 4 years. Like we've stated, doctors Daniel Halperin and Helen Epstein note that PEPFAR emphasizes abstinence rather than partner reduction. Abstinence is an unrealistic and laughable goal inside of Africa. Partner reduction is what worked in Uganda and what will work in other places. The current operating procedure for U.S. aid is wasteful, inefficient, and ineffective. Specifically on the international relations debate. The World Health Organization is an internationally acclaimed organization. No other organization is going to be able to command the same type of respect that the World Health Organization does. Because the EU and the United Nations have asked the United States to stop PEPFAR, that's going to be the best option in today's round. In conclusion, the affirmative's regional and inadequate solution will not address the 1.5 million health worker shortage. It will also hurt EU and UN relations between with the United States and will be emblematic of the United States PEPFAR and its inadequacies. The World Health Organization, on the contrary, offers a comprehensive and globally orchestrated solution that would address the worldwide shortage of health workers. We urge a negative ballot and endorsement of the World Health Organization.
Thank you very much. Final rebuttal for the affirmative.
There's too much at stake regarding the AIDS crisis not to take the most comprehensive approach possible to fight it. During the course of this debate, at least 100 Africans died of AIDS. In 2008, several million more Africans will die. As such, the proven efficacy of PEPFAR and its initiative should be preferred to a hypothetical World Health Organization program that has nothing to show for it. PEPFAR has already assisted people. Since its inception in 2003, it has provided critical treatment and prevention services to thousands of Africans. As outlined in our first speech, PEPFAR's abstinence-based programs have no shortage of success stories. For instance, in Zimbabwe, HIV prevalence fell by 23% and sexual activity outside of marriage decreased by 20% simply because of PEPFAR's ABC approach. Also, an emphasis on contraception has corresponded with a skyrocketing rate of HIV/AIDS in Botswana that has made it the single most devastated region in sub-Saharan Africa by HIV/AIDS. The negative cites a single example of Uganda being adversely affected by U.S. policy, but the president of Uganda recently endorsed the ABC approach, and Uganda is the poster child for the success of the ABC approach in that it used it to reduce AIDS rates to continentally low levels during the 90s. All of these statistics are based off of a report released earlier this month by a consortium of international health experts and are inherently preferable to the anecdotal examples of the negative. In fact, their principal author, Helen Epstein, stated on June 13th of last year that ignoring the need to promote fidelity in sexual relations may well have undermined efforts to fight the pandemic. The negative concedes our Rogers evidence, which suggests that the WHO provides drugs that fail bioequivalence tests and have empirically done nothing but breed drug resistance. In addition, as stated in the first speech, the WHO myopically focuses on scaling up ARV treatment for those who already are afflicted with AIDS rather than preventing new infections. The WHO does not build infrastructure because it's just a research organization. It cannot conduct these operations because it doesn't have the authority nor the finances to do so. Every approach the WHO has conducted to fight AIDS has been, as Kerry Roberts put it, a dismal failure. Why should we expect the counter-proposal to be any better? The U.S. also has a unique cultural relationship with Africa. The recent trip to Africa highlighted the cooperation between the U.S. and African nations and the fact that most African nations highly regard America. Finally, their counterproposal does not negate the resolution. It still advocates increasing U.S. assistance to Africa, but merely suggests that it should be through a different conduit. It also does not disprove the desirability of the affirmative. Perhaps the U.S. should increase funds for multilateral institutions. This is not foreclosed by the U.S. increasing unilateral assistance. A synthesis of both proposals would be best because it would include the most comprehensive approach to increasing access to medicine. As pointed out by Alex, even if they disband PEPFAR, President Bush and his cohorts will still just expand faith-based initiatives in other regards, which will compromise effectiveness. Any charge that we are not substantial is flawed. First, the affirmative is an endorsement of the present increase being debated in Congress regarding PEPFAR. A vote for the affirmative is a vote for PEPFAR's $50 billion extension, which overwhelms the amount of the increase that is proposed by the negative. Negative states that PEPFAR compromises U.S. relations with European countries. The argument is that unilateralism jeopardizes American standing in the world. This does not take into account that rampant unilateralism will still exist in the context of policies such as Iraq. It is also hard to comprehend why Europe would be upset that the United States is taking a humanitarian measure towards Africa. Statements of Jordan Caslow and Henry Fox, prominent figures in HIV/AIDS literature, suggest that leadership by the U.S. in improving world health would deflect increasing criticism abroad that the country prefers a unilateral approach. PEPFAR also works with numerous multilateral institutions and seeks to improve global cooperation in fighting AIDS rather than just blindly increasing bilateral assistance. One must ask oneself, is it really okay for the United States to let millions die just to preserve its image? Negative also states that we cannot solve the HIV/AIDS crisis because of its sheer magnitude. They correctly point out that AIDS exists outside of Africa, but Africa is the hotspot for the AIDS pandemic. It bears the bulk of the disease burden, but it only has 3% of the health professionals. The affirmative can put a large dent in this by focusing on training community health workers. As stated in our first speech, the GHS can train substitute health workers that are less inclined to migrate away from their homes. Statistics prove that these workers will not succumb to push and pull factors that normally cause others to leave. This can train thousands of crucial workers that are necessary to fighting the disease. There is no panacea for the AIDS crisis, but we cannot fall prey to the negative's charge that the affirmative cannot provide all the necessary health workers. The affirmative is a step in the right direction. Saying that we should not aid Africa because the problem is too dire is akin to the Western policy of appeasement towards Hitler before World War II. They also stated in their constructive that U.S. assistance might compromise an already fragile situation in Ethiopia. The hypothetical situation outlined by the negative, where we should withhold aid out of fear of how other nations will act, is irresponsible. We should not succumb to such excuses, because if we do, it literally means deaths of millions of Africans. The U.S. has the opportunity to exercise its immense leadership and technical proficiencies to save millions of African lives. We must not fail to act on our obligation.
Colleyville Heritage High School of Texas on the affirmative, Bellaire High School of Texas on the negative. Congratulations to both of you.
That concludes our 2007-2008 National Public Policy Forum Finals. Thank you all so much for joining us. Congratulations again to Colleyville Heritage and to Bellaire for an outstanding debate. For those of you joining us this evening for the awards banquet, we will meet at 7:30 p.m. across the street, directly behind this building, in a room called Lipton Hall, not to be confused with the building in which it resides, which is called D'Agostino Hall. So it's two halls, but you're going to D'Agostino Hall, which is on West 3rd Street, directly behind this building.
Time's up. Got my timer. You're done.
And you'll